Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. The next game is Donkey Kong 3. While Donkey Kong Jr. may not have been quite as successful as the original Donkey Kong, it still sold well and was considered a success for the company. In an attempt to continue to ride on the success of the original Donkey Kong, Nintendo made another game in the series and called it Donkey Kong 3. While this game was initially released in the arcades in September of 1983, the game received an NES port in 1984, similar to the other NES ports that launched with the system. These two versions are very similar, so I will go over both of them in this video. Unlike Donkey Kong Jr., Nintendo went a very different direction with the overall design of this one. It's not really a platformer at all anymore, and it bears more similarities to a shoot 'em up. Additionally, Mario is completely absent this time around, as you now play as Stanley the Bugman, who was first introduced in Game & Watch Greenhouse. A lot of people find Mario's absence odd, but considering that each game has had a different protagonist, and the primary focus of the series is on Donkey Kong himself, I personally don't find it too far out of left field. Unfortunately for Nintendo, these changes to the formula didn't really pay off, as the game performed significantly worse than its predecessors, especially in North America. It's worth noting that at this time, the arcade scene was seeing a decline in general, as the golden era of arcades was coming to an end. While this isn't the last arcade title Nintendo developed, around this time, Nintendo started to focus more on NES originals, and Nintendo's arcade games started to take a back seat. In this one, you were playing as Stanley, trying to protect a greenhouse from Donkey Kong and swarms of insects. Before a level starts, Donkey Kong smacks on a bunch of beehives, which is what triggers the bugs to attack. What is Donkey Kong even trying to accomplish here? The flyer doesn't really say much about what is going on or what his motives are. Maybe he's just had a bad day. The primary objective of this game is to spray Donkey Kong up to the top of the screen. You do this by maneuvering Stanley to the top of the stage and spraying bug spray at him. What makes this tough is that bees are swarming the screen and attack both the player and try to steal the plants along the bottom. Getting hit by these enemies makes you lose a life, and losing the plants will earn you less points at the end of the level. In the arcade version, getting hit by a bee is pretty brutal. The bugs all swarm you and leave nothing behind. Youch. In the NES version, they removed this animation and Stanley just lays on the ground after getting hit. There's a bunch of different enemy types, and they get introduced as you progress through more and more of the levels. In the first level, the only type of bee that exists is the buzz bee. These simple enemies fly around and try to steal flowers. They throw projectiles at you, which behave a bit differently in each version. Generally speaking, the projectiles in the arcade version are much faster and harder to dodge. Sometimes they would shoot these projectiles right when I jumped, and by that point it was already too late for me to dodge them. In contrast, I generally found the NES projectiles easier to dodge. Another big change was that in the arcade version, if the bee managed to take a flower, they would transform into a super bee. In this form, they are fast and aggressive, and would constantly charge at the player until they are defeated. This was completely removed in the NES version. I'm not sure if it was a hardware limitation or a balance decision, but once again, it made the NES version a bit easier. In later levels, the Buzzbee changes form into something larger, and I think they become more aggressive after this. In much later levels, a similar type of enemy appears, the Butterfly. These are upgraded versions of the Buzzbees, and don't appear until level 15 in the NES version and level 24 in the arcade version. While I did end up seeing them in the NES version, I never made it far enough in the arcade version to see them. After 3 levels, a completely different enemy is introduced, Bee Spees. These bees take 2 hits to destroy, and once you defeat them, 4 projectiles fly out from the bee. These projectiles always follow the same pattern, but they can be surprisingly tough to dodge, and it can cause instant death if you defeat the Bee Spee when they are directly above you. The last major bee type are attackers, which will travel down the sides and fly across the screen once they are lined up with Stanley. These enemies can really catch you off guard if you aren't paying attention. In later rounds, these get replaced with the Kabuto Mushi, a beetle variant that is larger and more difficult. There's one final type of enemy that's not a bee, the Creepies. These worms crawl across the stage and will defeat the player if they touch one. These enemies cannot normally be defeated, and they only freeze momentarily when hit by the bug spray. By themselves, these enemies wouldn't be too bad, but once the screen is covered in enemies, they become very obnoxious and greatly hinder your movement options. There's another thing you have to worry about in this game, and that is that there is a timer in the upper right corner. When this runs out in the arcade version, vine eaters show up and munch away at the bottom of Donkey Kong's vines, meaning it becomes increasingly hard to stop him from jumping down and laying the smackdown on the player. In the NES version, running out of time will instead cause him to just immediately jump down. Speaking of, throughout each level, Donkey Kong is slowly creeping downwards, and you have to spray him with the bug spray to keep him up. Let him get too low, and he'll jump down and beat you up, and you'll lose a life. As I said before, if you manage to spray him all the way up to the top though, you'll beat the stage. This is required for the final stage, but on the other two, you can also win by clearing out all the bees. I didn't actually know about the second method until much later. One final mechanic is that once per life, bringing Donkey Kong to a certain point gives Stanley Super Spray. This spray has a much longer range, and it can be used to push Donkey Kong up with ease. It even kills those pesky worm enemies I mentioned before. This power-up is on a timer and will last through from stage to stage, and I often found that I could push Donkey Kong up twice for each usage. Alright, let's look at my actual time with the game. Since it came out first, I played the arcade version first. Similar to the US version of the Donkey Kong games, not every level is introduced on the first loop. However, since there are only 3 levels, you'll see them all by the end of the second loop. Because of this, my main goal was just going to be beating the second loop, which meant beating 5 levels. In level 1, you start in a blue greenhouse. This level is pretty simple. Stanley has plenty of room to move around in, and you only have to worry about the buzz bees in this one. I beat this one pretty soundly. After pushing Donkey Kong up, the Super Spray fell down, and I used it to beat the level with ease. Since this is loop 1, the next level took me to the final greenhouse, the yellow greenhouse. This level is actually pretty different than the others. Instead of focusing on swarms of bees, Donkey Kong will occasionally throw coconuts at you, and they come in pretty fast if you aren't prepared. One of these caught me off guard, and I lost my first life here. Something else annoying in this level is that some creepies move back and forth across some vines, and they are constantly protecting Donkey Kong from getting hit. To make matters worse, hitting the creepies by mistake will stun them, which makes them actually protect Donkey Kong for even longer. Since the Super Spray respawned after I lost a life to the coconut, I was able to use this to beat the level. When you clear this one, Donkey Kong's head gets stuck in a beehive, and he tumbles to the ground. In celebration, Stanley does a little dance. It's not too big of a deal, but sadly, most of this cutscene is removed in the NES version, and Stanley just looks up at Donkey Kong instead. After beating this level, you are sent back to the blue greenhouse. I was able to continue the Super Spray I had in the last level, and I trounced this one. After this, you are sent to the final greenhouse we haven't seen yet, the gray greenhouse. The change here is simple, but it makes a huge difference. A chunk of the middle platform is missing, making it much harder to get to Donkey Kong and push him up. Around this point, the bees already start to get pretty hectic too. This level alone is so much harder than the others, and for me, it's what made longer runs more difficult. Even knocking down the Super Spray was tough in this one. The hecticness was already starting to become more than I could handle, and I lost 3 more lives to this one, but I did eventually manage to get another Super Spray and beat it. Using the continuation of the Super Spray, I trounced the yellow greenhouse again. At this point, I had already accomplished my goal, but I kept going to see how far I could make it. I was only able to beat 1 more level though, losing my last life to the gray greenhouse. I had already accomplished my goal after only 7 minutes, so I decided to give it a second go to see if I could make it any further. While I did manage to get a higher score, I once again lost to level 7 and decided to put the game away here. While for me, there was a 20 game gap between the 2 versions, let's take a look at my time with the NES version next. Like the other arcade ports, they added 2 different difficulty options, so my goal in this one was to beat 5 levels in both difficulties. While this version was generally much easier, I couldn't set the lives as high. However, it looks like having less lives wasn't enough to slow me down, as I beat level 5 easily in Game Mode A, and I made it all the way to level 10 before losing my last life. On to Game Mode B. While this run wasn't too difficult, I did find out that you can actually lose a life during the cutscene after pushing Donkey Kong to the top. Come on, I'd already beaten the level. Anyway, while I did cut this one pretty close, I beat level 5 with 0 lives remaining. I managed to hold on for quite a bit longer though, and I lost my last life to level 9. At this point, I was content with the game, although I did feel bad only giving it such a short amount of playtime. However, while writing the script for this video, I discovered the existence of some of the harder bugs that I never saw during these playthroughs. While I still think what I did previously was a good enough clear condition, I wanted to get some footage of these elusive bugs for this summary video, so I decided to go back to the game and check them out. I started with the NES version, since you only needed to make it to level 15 to see all the enemies. Even though I knew the NES version would be easier, I still struggled a bit to get to level 15. The gray greenhouse in particular was just very tough for me. I didn't know about the mechanic where you can beat the levels by defeating all the enemies, and I think it might have been easier for me if I just focused on that instead of pushing up Donkey Kong in this level. Eventually though, I made it to level 15 and saw both the beetles and the butterflies. I made it a bit further, and my run ended on level 18, where I died to one of those pesky beetles. After that, I switched to the arcade version. Despite having more lives, I knew this one was going to be harder, especially considering you needed to get to level 24 to see every enemy type. Honestly, I kinda knew that this one might be too tough, and I went in expecting to quit before making it to level 24. I had already cleared my win condition, and I figured I would be able to use the footage from the NES version when talking about the enemies. I still wanted to give it an honest try though. That being said, I was definitely right about the difficulty in this one. It didn't hit me until I played them both side by side, but man, this one is just so much more hectic than the NES version. I started to realize that in the gray greenhouse, I generally did better if I focused on taking out all the bees, but I still often died in the process. I did manage to get further than before, but boy was I struggling. Eventually, I made it to level 15, where, to my surprise, the game introduced a new mechanic. Donkey Kong now throws down coconuts, similar to the yellow greenhouse, but now in every level. Oh boy, just what I needed. The yellow greenhouse had less bees to balance out the throws from Donkey Kong, but adding them to these earlier levels is ridiculous. I still gave it one more go, and I did manage to make it a bit further, but after seeing this new mechanic, I decided to end the game here. Level 24 was not worth the amount of effort, and I at least already had seen the new enemies in the NES version. With that, both versions of Donkey Kong 3 were finally complete. On to the reviews. Looking back on the game, a lot of people consider these to be a bit of a downgrade from the previous entries, and honestly, I kind of agree with them. I did start to appreciate the game a bit more when I came back to them and learned more about how they worked, but the game just feels so simple in comparison to the first two games in the series. I can appreciate them for trying something different, but instead of going with what made the Donkey Kong games so revolutionary for the time, they instead went back to making a shoot-'em-up, which, as we already know, was a very common genre at the time. I wouldn't really call this one a bad game, though, and it's not like being a shoot-'em-up by itself is inherently a bad thing. Moving a character around a little stage and using puffs of bug spray is still pretty unique for a shoot-'em-up, and the variety of ways to win and lose are enough to keep the game interesting for a bit. That being said, I did find the game a little too chaotic, and sometimes it just didn't feel like Stanley had the maneuverability to keep up with the chaos. Since the stages are simple in comparison to the other Donkey Kong games, I can't help but wish there was a bit more variety here too. Donkey Kong had 4 unique stages, and they were pretty sizable too. Compare that to the 3 simple ones in this game, and it just feels like there's less content. When comparing the arcade and NES versions of this game, there's enough differences that it's hard to say which is better of the two. Like the other NES ports, there's less animations in the NES version, but I overall prefer the easier difficulty of that version. Ultimately though, it's not really enough for me to give the games a separate score, and I decided to give both of them a 6 out of 10. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.